I want to sort of start off by connecting this, what I'm going to speak, to this whole notion of equality jurisprudence and how it is sort of limited to how it is limited to the state and how we can demand accountability from the state. But what I'm really interested is how it sort of operates in our real lives beyond what Vajanti was speaking about, the non-state actors. And that's where most of our lives are sort of entwined on a day-to-day basis. How do we sort of address private acts of discrimination? And that is what sort of, and that is what I want to link to this whole climate of criminalization, or how trans persons across the register are sort of seen to be criminals. I sort of would also tie this up with what Aditya was saying in his presentation, where he spoke about, you know, and this sort of, I was a literature student, and there's this novel by Amitav Ghosh called Shadow Lines, and I don't know how many of you have read that, but in this particular part where he's describing the main protagonist who's drawn into this sort of a riot, this skirmish which sort of takes place, and Trideep is then finally sort of killed in that thing. And I was intrigued how Aditya was sort of relating this to the death of Tara recently, and what he sort of speaks of as this climate of pervasive violence in which we sort of exist. And he was also referring to another literary text. So I'm intrigued by how all of these, I mean, it's almost like an atmosphere within which we are placed and in which we are breathing. But before we do all of that, I want to also talk about the history of trans movements in India, and how I feel, which has been marked by several betrayals, and I call them betrayals. I mean, I don't want to do a timeline of this, but I certainly feel a little intrigued with the relationship that I see that the trans movements in India have had with the whole action around Section 377 and the campaign around Section 377 that has built up on the bodies of queer people and queer lives and our histories of persecution. And I somewhere feel that probably the histories of trans people have been sort of added on as a sort of an afterthought, if not as a footnote, as in sort of an asterisk, a very important footnote nonetheless, but a footnote actually. And we are probably not part of the main text. And this is, of course, a very subjective position, and we can have a conversation as to why I feel this way, but this feeling of mine has been culled from narratives of having spoken to several trans activists across India, and where we felt that, oh, there has been a slight, like we've been shortchanged in the long run. And this got sort of confirmed later on, and which I see as an act of betrayal, was when the Nalsa petition was sort of being filed. And this I speak for on behalf of trans men, because there was a strategic decision of keeping narratives of trans men out of the purview of the Nalsa petition in the beginning. And of course, there probably has been strategic reasons why that was being drafted, but you know, this act of having trans voices, trans men narratives, or people assigned gender female at birth, narratives of such people is not part of the main petition. And this came up a number of times in private conversations, in national consultations, in debriefings, as to how probably this is not something that the trans community was sort of looking at, and how we felt a little betrayed. I think later on, again with the Justice Verma Committee and its recommendations around sexual assault law, and the suggestions of which were again summarily taken away, and we have the amended version of, I mean, the Criminal Act, which was amended on sexual assault. Again, another site where we as trans communities have been kind of left toothless in the face of imminent violence and any recourse, any legal recourse to have to address these issues. And I think, I mean, in a sort, in this manner, if I were to look at what we have now as the proposed bill, post the Nalsa verdict, as I mean, a dangerous version of the bill, I think that's again somewhere where we are sort of, I mean, at least I feel betrayed again by what the Nalsa verdict seemed to hold a sort of promise. It has its own issues, but then it also had its own promises, and how summarily a lot of that is sort of being taken away. So I would like to sort of locate these experiences of loss and experiences of what I'm calling as betrayals in this whole notion of what Sudhir then kind of laid the framework for, is this whole notion of how trans communities are viewed in India. and I'm saying this from the perspectives that we know of histories of our of struggles. Within Karnataka, we've seen stories of how trans communities have been sort of taken away in the name of yes, precisely the false charges of kidnapping, castration, how house owners have been threatened not to give rent to trans and have been evicted, how auto drivers have been sort of threatened of not taking trans passengers, etc., etc., etc. There are countless narratives of how police stations, local police stations, in West Bengal we don't have a local police act, but that specifically targets, say, amongst others, trans communities, but then we know of police stations maintaining registries of transgender sex workers, and Raina's here, she can corroborate this, that how streets have been mapped and trans people's identities and photographs are there in police stations, and they maintain registers as to, and in any case of, in any case that the police can sort of haul us up. We also have these notions of what is a city and like who can be part of the city. So you have schemes like national schemes like the JNNURM, which is about the beautification of cities and how cities need to be modeled. Like all airports are like seem to be like twins of each other. We have cities which almost look like each other. So which are all part of this general scheme of beautifying cities. And many of us as trans people who are homeless, who are vagrant, who are there on the streets do not fit into the scheme, and how the criminalization or the eyes through which we are seen as criminals and unwanted, then also summarily sort of remove us from these public spaces. And we've also known how in Karnataka people have been sent to beggar colonies or have resisted the fact that they will be sort of being forcibly sent to beggar colonies, and the very existence of beggar colonies on the fringes of these burgeoning cities and highways. And so one of my friends, she earns her livelihood from asking for money at traffic signals, and then she had a very interesting take on the role of flyovers in the city. Flyovers that we sort of very happily kind of accept to ease our journey. Okay, we zip to the airport or we zip to some other place. And she said, like now I was there at this traffic intersection, at this 5-point intersection, and I used to sort of earn because all the cars used to sort of stop at this intersection. And now there is this flyover, and I have to really now look for another space where we sort of go because no cars are stopping at this intersection. So it's interestingly how the architecture of a city space, and I keep speaking of this and I see a direct correlation between how the city architecture sort of lends itself to alienating and um, well, sort of making it very, very clear how trans communities, amongst others, and I say this amongst others because the battle is really fraught around class and caste lines. I mean, see, what is happening is, and we were doing this survey for, because Calcutta never had this culture where we would see a lot of trans people in traffic intersections. And over the past 4 or 5 years, we were seeing more and more trans people coming into traffic intersections. And we were actually wondering is what is the reason why we suddenly see this surge? And so we were doing this survey, and as part of the survey, what came out was, and we were speaking to a range of trans women at traffic intersections, and what they were saying is, that there has always been a movement from villages to the city for people in search of work, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation, etc. A number of trans people, very loosely defined, would come to the city in search of job and work. They would get employed within Hijra folds. But the Hijra folds are also getting saturated because as we see the city, the architecture of the city sort of giving in more and more into gated communities. And gated communities are where you would have the security apparatus sort of blocking the entry of, again, unwanted persons, Hijras, street vendors. So we would have to go to a shopping mall to buy a matchbox. But the local shops would be sort of evicted, the local hawkers would be evicted. But because this is what we have been now, this is what the cities are beginning to look like. They're beginning to look alike, they're beginning to look like each other. And in this process of us becoming twins of each other, we are actually sort of physically delimiting spaces for many, many communities and people who cannot probably access these sites. So because I hate visiting friends who live in gated communities, because then you need to wait at the security and write your name down and this and that, etc. The whole pretext of security is sort of then used as a gatekeeping mechanism. It is actually the gatekeeping that is happening there, and Hijras are losing out on livelihoods. It is affecting, amongst others, Hijras are affected by how the city architecture is changing, housing societies are changing, the relationships between people who own the houses and those who are in the fringes of providing security, cover, etc., is anyway hierarchical and very, very skewed. But then, even then, and it is being used as a means to keep away and keep the unwanted lot out. So we found out that, so the traffic intersection seemed to be another model, which again from Bombay or other cities that Calcutta sort of picked up. So what happens is it's this very strange, nebulous space where I can never fit in any one space. So whichever space I go to as being a working class or a caste minority trans person, because I don't have to go and beg. I identify as a trans person. I am not going and begging in the traffic intersection. But my sister is who is coming from a working class background. So that the city and the spaces, the police system, they are all sort of, I think, as much as we speak of Section 377 and how it sort of affects our lives, we all understand that, like, following the 11, 12, 13 verdict, what was happening is, on newspapers, we had these headlines saying gay sex illegal. Now, nobody knows who's gay, but everybody knows who's Hijra and who's trans on the street. And especially if you're working class and if you're on the street, we are the first ones who are going to be getting the brick bats. So the point is, like, the movement has sort of, and this is it's an entirely personal feeling. It's actually something that's lying very uneasily within me as a trans person. I feel that the movement has sort of very cleverly sort of kept us there as a footnote, but then the real concerns as trans people, as working class trans people, who are out there begging, who are out there, and it's not just true for trans people that all trans people are either beggars or in the Hijra Gharana. There are many of us who are working in smaller factories and establishments. We are there in the brick kilns. We are there working in, we are working as cooks. We are working as masons. There's a range of professions in which that we are finding ourselves in. But this overt, I think the issues, I mean, how many of us are sort of, I mean, are there conversations that progressive movements are sort of having with trans rights groups, especially ones that the labor unions, the labor conventions? Are they even talking about the transgender, the people who are there as part of the labor force and who are trans in the factories? I don't see that conversation happening. Immediately after the 2014, the NALSA, the verdict, there has been an amendment in the Factories and Establishments Act. The act is as old as 1948. The amendment happened in September 2014. How many of us know of the fact that the Factories and Establishment Act amendment speaks about the inclusion of transgender people? I mean, however problematic that is and however tokenistic that might seem. Unions, workspaces have very, very little, they don't have any information. They would speak about maternity and sexual harassment, of course with the push of the women's movements, etc., and longer conversations, but the fact that trans people are there and they're very much part of the workforce is again something that is, so we are either seen as criminals. I mean, I'm almost touching my time. So this is generally the universe I just wanted to map and speak about the fact that this is probably, and probably Aditya is right, this is the climate of violence that we live in. The climate that which sort of looks at us as unwanted. And this is what I call an apartheid. This is apartheid. Thank you.